If you can excuse the pun, I've cut a few corners by using the jigsaw, which means that some of the joints are not as straight or square as they should be. So I'm going to spend some time tidying those up to make them a little more flush. It's super windy here, and I'm having trouble keeping everything together and not blowing around the yard. What I'm going to do next is replace the idea that I had to use these blocks to attach the two beams together at each corner. I'm actually going to replace it with some diagonal braces, and that should be a little bit stronger, because what I was finding was that these blocks here were splitting when I was screwing them together, even though I drilled some pilot holes. So what I've done is I've put in the diagonal braces here, and you can see that each corner is square. Even though there are some gaps, I can shim those up if I need to. What I did was I cut these braces at 45-degree angles and screwed them in, so now I know that the tabletop is square. Now for a bit of fun with the router. What I have here is a sacrificial piece of wood that I'm going to test this out on, because I need to cut a channel in the crossbeam on the table so that it can receive the bracer that is on the base of the tabletop. Otherwise it's going to seesaw up and down before I secure it, so I need to make sure that it will fit in and it will be flush with the tabletop. So what I have is a jig that I set up, and there are two stop blocks either side of the mark that I put in there, which is the width of the piece of wood of one of the bracers. And what's going to happen is that I'm going to route the groove using those stop blocks as my template. And what I've also done is I've set the plunge depth on the router so that it can only go as far down as the depth of this piece of wood. So we'll see how we get on. Well, it kind of worked, and it's a good thing that I was testing out on pieces of wood first, otherwise I wouldn't have found these things out. The first thing with my jig on the first piece of wood was that I had used the edges of the plate as the guide, and then completely failed to realize that these edges are actually curved. So when I'm using a forward and backwards motion like that with the router, and it's following the stop blocks as a guide, then it was following the curve of the plate, so that meant that the cut was not straight. So I had to try a second piece of wood, and this wasn't so bad. This is actually, I used a side to side motion this time, like that, with a guide like that. Now the problem I was finding is that this gap here, the groove that I'm actually cutting, is just a little bit longer when I have the bit in place. It's just a little bit longer than the width of the plate, which meant that the plate was falling into the gap, and you can see, I've cleaned this up a little bit, but you can see that there were some points where I plunged a little farther than I needed to. So I've got to work out how I can stop that from happening. It may be that I do this in a couple of parts, where have a piece of wood like this across the gap, and I'm going to cut that much and then swap over and do that much. But the width isn't too bad. I did draw, or I did set my stop blocks in fact, so that they should have hit the lines. I did make sure that it was at the point where the bit was at its widest, but obviously this was a little too wide, so there is some movement here. It may be that I maybe set the stop block too much on this side and not enough on that side, because you can still see the pencil mark there. And then what I was also finding was the actual groove itself isn't even, and that could be related to how I was not using the plunge correctly, and it was not going far enough. But all in all, I'm starting to get used to it, and next time it should be a little better.